About 2,000 years ago, Jesus and his disciples are serving people in need in the areas surrounding the small village of Nazareth. They provide cures for the poor, they bring hope to the destitute, and they affirm the marginalized. Throngs of people flock to Jesus and his disciples, and the crowds swell to chaotic numbers as they desperately reach for the healing and the joy which Jesus and his disciples are freely giving away. After days and weeks of hard work, Jesus decides he and his disciples need a break. And so he says to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." Now today we do not know the exact location of the, quote, deserted place. Jesus led his disciples, but our best guess is it's somewhere on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. The weary travelers walk to the southern tip of the sea and set sail to the north, expecting to see an empty hillside next to the water where they can eat without interruption, wade in the cool waters, and take a satisfying nap. Unfortunately, the peaceful hillside they expect hosts a mob of people awaiting their arrival. Upon sight of the crowd, I imagine the disciples groan in exhaustion. But Jesus, filled with compassion, does not order the ship to turn around. Instead, he stays the course. Once ashore, Jesus begins to teach, to heal, and to care for the people. A handful of hours later, in the deluge of people, Jesus turns to his disciples and asks, "Can you give them something to eat?" And in one of the great lines in all of Scriptures, the disciples shoot back, "You want us to spend half a year's wages on bread for them to eat?" My friends, as a person who organizes events for a living, allow me to say that the disciples' reaction is an understandable reaction, right? Logistically, Jesus asks the disciples for the impossible. Feed 5,000 families in a deserted place without any consideration of the cost. And the disciples react with math, expenses, data, and spreadsheet, underscored with a hint of indignation. Jesus, however, gently encourages the disciples to go into the crowd and see what food they brought with them. Now, after an extensive survey of the masses, the disciples report that all they can find is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Without any kind of window into the physics of how this might be possible, Mark writes, "Then Jesus took the 5 loaves of the 2 fish, raised his eyes to the heavens, and said the blessing. Jesus broke the loaves and handed them to his disciples to distribute among the people. He also passed out the 2 fish among them." And just like that, the disciples pass out meal after meal after meal after meal to the multitude. Now, a skeptic may read this story and think, it must have been a bit of a letdown when one family received their portion of 1/1000th of a fish. But Mark rushes in to clarify. They all ate until they had their fill. In all, 5,000 families ate that day. Somehow, some way, Jesus managed to feed 5,000 families with just 7 portions of food. This scientifically inexplicable action is cause for celebration. I imagine that if you and I were there, we would be filled with a kind of reverent awe. We would raise our hands in the air and shout, "Hallelujah," and ask the band to play a song of praise as we stand and worship the magnanimity of our Creator, the one who feeds the hungry and provides for all. But before anyone can pop open a bottle of champagne, Jesus suddenly commands the disciples to go back to the boat. He tells them he needs time alone to pray. In the meantime, he asks the disciples to sail to Bethsaida and promises he will meet them there when his time of solitude is over. Then Jesus dismisses the well-fed crowd, and the disciples head into the heart of the Sea of Galilee as the sun begins to set. A few hours later, a ferocious storm appears out of nowhere and strains the disciples' boat to the limit. They scramble to distribute oars in the middle of the night and begin to paddle with all of their might. They row, and they row, and they row, with their heart's rates maxed in zone 5 until exhaustion begins to win. Doubt creeps up each of their spines as they wonder if this storm will be their last storm. Suddenly, a ghost appears on the water. An icy kind of fear freezes each of the disciples' hearts. They scream, they yell, they cry out to God. Some even believe they are already dead. But the ghost says, "Calm yourselves. It's me. Don't be afraid." The ghost is Jesus walking on water in the middle of a storm in the heart of the Sea of Galilee. Now, Jesus plods along over to the boat, lifts his leg over the stern, and as soon as his sandal touches the deck, the storm dissipates. The disciples are utterly astounded. But here's where this story takes an unexpected turn. They are utterly astounded, not because they are alive after death seemed imminent, nor are they astounded because Jesus walked on water, and they aren't even astounded because Jesus flexed his mutant superpower and controlled the weather. No. Mark tells us they are utterly astounded because they still did not understand what Jesus did with the bread. I picture Jesus getting into the boat and saying something like, "If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you too can walk on water." And the disciples respond with, "Do not change the subject on us, Jesus. What is the deal with the bread?" What's particularly surprising about this story is the author claims the disciples witnessed two stupendous miracles. And rather than offering a toast to the Son of God or saying, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me," or singing, "You make me brave" at the top of their lungs, they are filled with skepticism. They are filled with doubt, anxiety, and fear. To describe all of the emotions the disciples feel in this unforeseen letdown, Mark writes, "For the disciples did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." These are some aggressive words from Mark. A long time before this story occurs, an infamous figure in Jewish history suffered from a hardened heart. And I am certain every one of Mark's intended readers would have made a cognitive connection to this historical figure. So, 1,300 years before this story occurs, or from our vantage point today, 3,300 years ago, a story unfolds in the empire of Egypt, which is recorded in the book of Exodus. For 400 years, the empire enslaved the children of Israel to boost their economy, to build bricks for their monuments, and to fortify their military. From generation to generation, the ruler of the empire, Pharaoh, oversaw the laws and operations which held this empire together. And for 400 years, the pharaohs enforced and encouraged this forced labor with an understanding that this social hierarchy was ordained and blessed by the gods. Until one day, two freed Israelites, Moses and his brother Aaron, arrived in Pharaoh's court. They demanded Pharaoh abandon the institution of slavery immediately because their God would no longer tolerate this sinful behavior. Pharaoh refused to emancipate the slaves, however. But he did not refuse just once. He refused to liberate the Israelites time and time again in this story. Now, the author of Exodus could have written, "Pharaoh said no." Or they could have written, "Pharaoh once again denied their request." Or the author could have even written, "Pharaoh shook his head." But the author chose a more poetic route to describe Pharaoh's repeated refusal. Every time Pharaoh rejected the request for liberation, the readers are told Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And as the author weaves the narrative together, they go back to this metaphor over and over again, and by my count, it's 17 different times before the Israelites are finally freed by the mighty hand of God. The idea of a hardened heart is entrenched in the story of the Israelites' liberation. 1,300 years later, Mark utilizes this loaded metaphor to stir the reader to draw a comparison from the disciples' confusion about the bread to the hardened heart of the domineering Pharaoh. At first glance, Mark's comparison of 12 peasants to a dictator seems excessively harsh, right? But if we look closely at the story of Pharaoh's hardened heart, similarities between these distant hearts begin to spring to the surface. In Exodus, Moses and Aaron went before the Pharaoh and prophetically declared slavery to be against the will of God. In Pharaoh's court, they dared the most powerful man in the empire to imagine a nation without forced labor. At this moment, Pharaoh had a decision to make. He could open himself to a new and beautiful reality, the likes of which the world had never seen before, a reality where human beings were free and equal souls and everyone could work and live as they chose, or Pharaoh could close himself off to a new way of seeing the world and continue on the path of the current reality, a reality which maintained the current power structures in the empire and continued to oppress more and more people due to humankind's insatiable avarice. Now, it is entirely possible that in all of Pharaoh's life, Moses and Aaron are the first two people to ever suggest to him that he could liberate slaves. The first people to ever suggest to him that he could be the head of state of an empire of free people. That they are the first people ever to suggest to him that he could be forever etched in the history books as one of the most forward-thinking human beings to ever grace the earth. And in this story, Moses and Aaron invited Pharaoh into a new and beautiful reality. But Pharaoh declined the invitation. Pharaoh doubled down on comfort. Pharaoh doubled down on known quantities. And he doubled down on the status quo. He saw a vision of what the world could be and turned a blind eye. This is a devastating turn, isn't it? So devastating that the author of Exodus describes it as Pharaoh hardened his heart. Looking at the story from this angle, a hardened heart is not reserved for powerful people who make decisions about which alter the course of history. Rather, a hardened heart is a regular and frequent temptation in the human experience. I define a hardened heart this way. We suffer from a hardened heart whenever we reject an invitation to participate in a beautiful and new reality. 1,300 years later, on a boat in the Sea of Galilee at the ripe hour of 3 a.m., mere seconds after they survived death, Mark insinuates the disciples reject an invitation from Jesus Christ to participate in a new and beautiful reality. Which raises the question, what is this new and beautiful reality that Jesus Christ is inviting them into with this miracle, and how are the disciples rejecting it? For me, the answer to this question is murky, especially when we read the stories of Mark 6 in isolation. But after a fascinating story about washing hands happens in chapter 7, which we will talk about next week, we get a sense of deja vu in chapter 8 when Jesus and his disciples travel to another deserted place on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee in the country of the Gerasenes. In the wilderness, on the other side of the sea, once again, a large crowd of people assembles. And once again, they have nothing to eat. Beat for beat, Jesus feels compassion for them and suggests to his disciples that they should feed this swarm of people. And in response, the disciples retort, "How can anyone give these people enough bread in this desolate place?" Now, just 2 chapters ago, we discussed how an objection like this one was completely understandable. But so much has changed since their last objection. The disciples saw Jesus feed 5,000 families with their own eyes. The disciples handed out the multiplied bread with their own hands. The disciples smelled the multiplied fish with their own nostrils. With that experience in their memories, those same disciples should be the ones who go to Jesus before Jesus goes to them and says, "Jesus, hey, these people are hungry. Here's a few loaves of bread that we found. Can you do your multiplication magic and feed them so they don't become restless?" But this is the opposite of what the disciples do. Instead, they retreat back to their spreadsheets and calculators and deem the request of Jesus to be, once again, impossible. While the disciples' first reaction was understandable, the second reaction is, to say the least, surprising. But may I remind you, Mark warned us about this reaction back in chapter 6, because the disciples suffer from a hardened heart, which means Jesus gave them a glimpse of a better reality, and rather than accepting the invitation and stepping into that reality, they closed themselves off and declined to attend. Therefore, this reaction should not take us by surprise. Rather, we can acknowledge that this reaction here is the reaction of a hardened heart. The narrative continues. In a nearly identical pattern as the first story, the disciples find 7 loaves and a handful of fish. Jesus prays, and physics are ignored, and the disciples begin to distribute the food. And in that distribution, they discover that the food, once again, is miraculously multiplied. Mark describes it this way: the people in the crowd ate until they were filled. Those who had eaten numbered about 4,000. After feeding the multitudes, Jesus dismisses the crowd and heads toward the boat with the disciples. Before they cast off, a handful of religious leaders, who I assume did not witness the phenomenon of feeding 4,000, point blank demand Jesus to perform a miracle in their presence. Jesus declines and replies, "Why does this generation demand a sign? The truth is, no sign will be given to this generation," and then gets in the boat and leaves. Once they are well underway, a sinking feeling begins to drag the disciples down, as they realize that the duration of their nautical voyage is long, and they only have brought 1 loaf of bread for them to eat. They are terrified to tell their rabbi Jesus about the mistake they made, so they all remain silent on the issue. Once again, at this point in the story, the disciples should be singing songs about shouting the name of Jesus from the mountaintops. But instead, they settle into a quiet state of fear, hoping Jesus will not recognize their inadequate rations. During a pregnant pause that is well into its 3rd trimester, Jesus says, "Watch out, beware of the yeast of the religious leaders and the yeast of the king." These words cut like a knife through the disciples. Assuming his reference to yeast is a subliminal roast of their lack of bread, one of the disciples fesses up and says, "Look, we're sorry about the bread. We should have brought more than just 1 loaf." Now, as I read the text, Jesus seems annoyed by this confession. He asks, "Why are you still talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand?" And then he says the quiet part out loud, "Are your hearts hardened?" These words of Jesus, recorded by Mark, call us back to the first occurrence of deja vu in Mark 6, back before the second miraculous feeding occurred, when the disciples, with their hardened hearts, still did not understand about the bread. This callback cements the link between these two stories and requires us to always consider the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 as one story. Together, these stories here construct a clear, perfect, symmetrical pattern. A large crowd assembles. Jesus says, "We should feed these wonderful people," and the disciples holler back, "Jesus, we don't have enough food." And then Jesus shows each of them that they, in reality, have more than enough food for everyone. In summary, the disciples see and experience the world through a lens of scarcity. They do not have enough food. They do not have enough money. They do not have enough power. And they do not have enough for everyone. Scarcity rules the way the disciples think and operate. They fight tooth and nail to ensure their own survival, while every person needs to ultimately fend for themselves. The gospel of Jesus Christ is good news for everyone who lives with a mentality of scarcity. Jesus offers a way for people to rise above their paradigms of not enough and step into a better way of living. By feeding thousands of people with only a handful of resources, Jesus invites the disciples to see and experience the world through a lens of abundance. I have been a pastor for nearly 15 years now, and I have learned that when I say the word abundance, it is often misunderstood. So allow me to clarify what abundance means. Abundance is not excess. Abundance is not the ability to have everything you want, whenever you want it, and however you want it to be. Abundance is not unlimited streams from unlimited artists and unlimited songs. Abundance is not free refills, not another pair of shoes, not a 12th guitar in your collection, not a pay raise, not more followers, and not more square footage in your house. And most importantly, abundance is not greed. In fact, abundance is the opposite of greed. Abundance is the ability to look at your entire life and the entire world that we live in and see that you and I are blessed beyond measure. This eternal invitation to live a life of abundance is so grand that it transcends trivial categories of religion, space, time, and location. About 700 years ago, Hafiz, an Iranian Muslim genius of a wordsmith, composed a poem about God's universal invitation to discard our lenses of scarcity and live in the new and beautiful reality of abundance. In his poem, To Build a Swing, he writes, "You carry all the ingredients to turn your life into a nightmare. Don't mix them. You have all the genius to build a swing in your backyard for God. That sounds like a hell of a lot more fun. Let's start laughing, drawing blueprints. Let's start gathering our talented friends. I will help you with my divine lyre and drum. Hafiz will sing 1,000 words, and you can take those words into your hands like golden saws, silver hammers, polished teakwood, strong silk rope. You carry all the ingredients to turn your existence into joy. Mix them. Mix them." As we listen to this poem together some 7 centuries after its birth, I am moved by the elegance of Hafiz's ability to put the concept of abundance into words. You carry all the ingredients to turn your existence into joy. My friends, do you actually believe this? Do you believe in your life, here in the year 2024, you already have everything you need to turn your existence into joy? This takes great faith. Faith is not the ability to believe ridiculous and unprovable things. Faith is what we trust about the nature of this existence. And if we trust the idea of abundance and trust that we already carry all of the ingredients to turn our existence into joy, well, that trust would change the way you and I behave today, would it not? You carry all the ingredients to turn your existence into joy. This is what it means to see your life in this world through a lens of abundance. These words are one and the same as the invitation Jesus Christ extends to his disciples with these miraculous feedings of massive crowds. The point of this miracle is not for you to believe it happened. The point of the miracle is to invite you into a new and beautiful reality. Imagine a scenario where God leads you to the top of a mountain. Now, once you arrive at the summit, God holds up a scroll that is unlike anything you have ever seen. After a minute, God unfurls the scroll along the base of the valley below you, and you realize the scroll contains every moment of your life, the highs and the lows, the joys and the sorrows, the romance and the breakups, the triumphs and the trials. In this scenario, when you look down at this expansive scroll on the valley floor, what do you feel? If you feel embarrassed, I want you to know there are times in my life I have felt embarrassed too. If you feel proud, I want you to know there's been times in my life where I felt proud too. If you feel like a failure, I want you to know there have been times in my life where I have felt like a failure too. And while I have felt all of these things, I believe a life of abundance is one that is able to look at the entire scroll and feel gratitude. As a dear mentor once told me, gratitude is the greatest indicator of spiritual maturity. And if you have ever looked at the entirety of your life from this elevated position and felt gratitude for the scroll of your life, then I want you to know there are times that in my life I have felt that gratitude too. And I believe those moments of gratitude are the moments we accept the invitation from Jesus Christ to live in abundance. All we need to do is trust the invitation in this new and beautiful reality. My friends, your life is enough. You have everything you need. You are blessed beyond measure. You do not exist to buy more things. You do not need more to be happy. God has already emptied the heavenly storehouses and given you this one precious and untamable life. You carry all the ingredients you need to turn your existence into joy. The wisdom of the Christian tradition teaches us that one of the greatest obstacles to accepting this invitation to abundance is a hardened heart, which means we must be aware of the state of our hearts. Consider for a moment that after seeing Jesus Christ feed 9,000 families with a total of 12 loaves of bread and even less fish, the disciples are in a boat with that same Jesus Christ, and they only have one loaf of bread between the 13 of them. And rather than thinking, we have more than enough bread for all of us, they think, this one loaf could never feed all of us. I hope I get the biggest piece. How else would you describe this ludicrous situation other than the disciples hardened their hearts? And while we often think, if I was just a little closer to God, then I would have all that I need to be happy. Or if I could only see the work of God firsthand, then I would no longer doubt a life of abundance is possible. Then we would all of a sudden tell ourselves we could be happy if we experienced that firsthand. But when we look closely at these stories, we realize that apparently you can witness a divine miracle and still suffer from a hardened heart. No, wait, make that 2 divine miracles because there were 2 feedings. No, wait, make that 3 because there was walking on water as well. It's possible to still suffer from a hardened heart even when you see the work of God firsthand. Going back to the boat, remember that the disciples are in a tiny boat mere feet away from the incarnation of the Son of God. Apparently, you can be in the exact same boat as Jesus Christ and still suffer from a hardened heart. In other words, no matter how close you are to God, or how many miracles you witness in your lifetime, or how many pages of the Bible you read, or how much you think correctly about God, you will still face the temptation of a hardened heart. For the duration of the rest of our lives, we will receive frequent invitations to grace, inclusion, and mercy. When we receive these invitations, we will always have a choice to make. We can step into that beautiful reality, or we can turn our backs on the invitation to preserve our own personal comfort. This is the universal temptation of the hardened heart, which is why all of us need recurring moments in our lives when we slow down, sit in silence, and feel the weight of our heart. In the Christian tradition, the season of Lent is the designated time on the calendar when we prioritize this self-examination, which is the season we are in now. As we discussed last week, the 40 days of Lent honors the 40 days Jesus Christ spent in the wilderness. For 40 days, Jesus participated in this process of self-examination before he set out to the villages and cities and proclaimed the good news of the gospel to the world. This 1,700-year-old tradition of Lent, coupled with the stories of Mark 6 and Mark 8, challenge all of us to weigh our own heart and ask a question of inward reflection. How has my heart become jaded? Think for a moment about the people or the experiences you are quick to judge. Consider the times when people around you are filled with hope and you resent them for being optimistic. Contemplate the instances when someone asked for your help and you convinced yourself it was better to turn your back. I do not ask you to think about these things to make you feel guilt or to feel shame. Remember, you are loved by your Creator unconditionally, whether your heart is jaded or not. Instead, I ask you to think about your heart and how much it weighs, because I know you are a good person. And I know you want to live with a willing and generous heart. And the way we move from a jaded heart to a willing one requires us to be honest with ourselves and ask questions like, how has my heart become jaded? Giving ourselves an answer to this difficult question can be hard. Because when we talk about the jaded portions of our hearts, we almost always end up talking about the heartbreaking experience of broken trust. The story of broken trust is one where we stepped out in faith, trying to help another, or trying to be generous, or trying to be more loving, and those intentions and actions are rejected. Or worse yet, you bend over backwards to help someone, and they misinterpret your actions and tell everyone they know about how terrible you are. When this happens, the heart, in an effort to protect itself, calluses. The heart retracts into its shell as it shouts internally, well, I'll never do that again. Or that's the last time I help anyone. Or I knew it. Next time I will trust my gut instead of my heart. There is nothing sinful about the heart doing this. This is a natural defense mechanism. In fact, this is a good thing for the heart to initially do after broken trust. After all, we need to take some time out and assess what happened in this scenario of broken trust, and if necessary, take time to grieve. But the wisdom of the Christian tradition, and Hafiz would say the wisdom of the Muslim tradition, is an understanding that God does not desire for us to live our whole lives with jaded hearts. Instead, God wants us to believe in our own resilience and to eventually soften our broken hearts so that we might one day love again and see and experience life through the lens of abundance. How has my heart become jaded? I would love for you to join me and everyone in this church in self-examination as we ask this question throughout the week to come. My friends, this is the Christian season of Lent. And if you are Christian, Muslim, atheist, Buddhist, Hindu, or agnostic, then I want you to know I am glad you are here today exactly the way you are. And I want to invite you, no matter what you believe or do not believe about the divine, to join us on an inward journey to examine our hearts. I want to invite all of us to ask, how has my heart become jaded? And when we arrive at that difficult answer to that question, I want to remind all of us that we are loved unconditionally by our Creator. I want to invite all of us to soften our hearts and to dare to love again. And then I want to extend the invitation of Jesus Christ to you to see and experience this life and world through a lens of abundance. May you trust the wisdom of the Muslim poet and see that you carry all the ingredients you need to turn your existence into joy. May you avoid the temptation of a jaded and hardened heart and accept the invitation to live with a generous and willing heart. And may you become aware of the unlimited abundance in this beautiful life and respond with gratitude. Amen.